His voice began to lose volume as my pulse quickened and drummed in my ears. My hands clutched at the table like I was having a heart attack. It's one thing to think your wife is having fun with another man and quite another when it's confirmed by a near stranger. Clarence kept talking, but I could barely hear anything. I was still burning inside and struggling to pull myself together. Besides, Mr. Miller has been diagnosed with a very aggressive pancreatic cancer, and he only has a few months to live. He tried to realize what was that I said. That Miller has been diagnosed with metastatic pancreatic cancer. He's now undergoing therapy for the second time, but it doesn't seem to be working. This confirmed what Chad had said and what I had discovered, but I didn't know that the cancer was incurable and inevitable. I finally understood Jean's behavior, her state of mind, everything. She was in pain because she was mourning the man she loved. She was trying to come to terms with his impending demise. I told Clarence about Jean's behavior and how I thought it all connected. Not because he was my friend, not because he was my confidant, but because he was here in front of me, and I just needed someone to talk to. My initial impression of Clarence's hidden depth was confirmed by his next words. Many cheaters try to minimize their actions by saying it was just sex or that it meant nothing, but that's nonsense, Mr. Carter. He took a sip of his almost cold coffee and made a grimace, then looked at me again. Cheaters don't just do it, they're investing in each other and in the relationship. He frowned as if fishing the words out of his memory. Women need to feel loved. No one has a long-term relationship because of sex. They may start out that way, but after a while, feelings emerge, love. And it's usually justified by the claim that you can love more than one person. He looked up, assessing the effect his words had on me. Cheaters don't spend all their time having sex, Mr. Carter. They go to restaurants and movies, they go for walks and share experiences. They discuss movies, books, politics, and ideas. They develop a personal language as spouses. They share their hopes and dreams and invariably lament that their illicit relationship is not their permanent relationship. He nodded his head as if agreeing with himself. They typically find faults in their spouse to appease their behavior and justify their cheating. And then discuss their spouse's real, perceived, or attributed faults with their other in an attempt to justify their immoral activities. I was shocked and devastated. I mean, I understood all of that, but honestly, it wouldn't have hurt as much to think that they were dating to engage in it. My wife was in a relationship with another man who gave her all the same things I did, but without the burdens of raising children, settling life scores, household chores, and all the rest. She gave him all of her attention. He gave her the good times without the daily drudgery that a normal marriage is saturated with, and nothing that would turn their time into the less exciting and more routine life that husbands and wives mostly share. We talked some more, and then agreed to stop investigating for a while I considered my next steps. He left, and I was left to sit and ponder what my life now looked like. One thing I knew for sure, my marriage was over, and this delusional reasoning of staying together for the sake of the children was beyond me. As unpleasant as the thought of being separated from my children was, the reality was that 60% of children in the U.S. live in separated or divorced families anyway. I guess mine would be no different. I sipped my rapidly cooling coffee. The pain coursing through my insides was real, and at the very least, it was going to take its toll on Jean and Miller. I did my best to muffle my emotions. These angry, hurt, anguished, and somewhat irrational thoughts wouldn't help me. I thought back to my work in the Far East, where I had encountered quite a few old-style executives. They tended to view business and even life in multi-generational terms. They also behaved much like the Southern Europeans. When two families went to war, there was and would be no reprieve until one of them was completely wiped out. Easier said than done. I wasn't the head of a triad or a godfather in the mafia. I was just an ordinary man living a fairly ordinary life. I didn't have any superpowers, nor did I have some omnipotent ally who owed me a great deal. The only thing that was certain was that I was, in this case, alone. I asked for more coffee to be brought in and pondered, wondering how I was going to get revenge on a dying man. As far as Jean was concerned, it was simple. Something she loved and treasured had been taken from her. In other words, everything she valued in life. Easier said than done, but a plan had already matured in my mind. But first things first, my real and immediate problem was Miller. I knew he'd made no promises of fidelity to me. He wasn't married to me, he was married to Jean. Yet he knew she was married and went after her anyway, thus disrespecting me, my marriage, and my children. Intelligence had to be done. My anger, fueled by pain, began to flare up again. All of my early psychological evaluations at work revealed, among other things, 2 traits that needed to be monitored and managed. First, I was risk-averse, which was certainly a double-edged sword to keep an eye on in a company characterized by a conservative approach to trading. And second, I was stubborn to the point of becoming intransigent as soon as I chose a position. And it was these 2 traits that were driving me now. I retaliated, regardless of the consequences, and I would not back down until one side was defeated, even if that side was me. The embryo of a plan began to form in my head. I called Clarence and, without going into detail, asked him to find as many troubled women as possible that the Millers had helped through their program. It wasn't a fully formed plan, it was mostly just another fishing trip. But I was catching big fish. In 2014, I was transferred to our Kenya branch for 3 weeks, and on a free weekend. I joined a local team for some deep-sea sport fishing in the Indian Ocean. There, I learned some valuable lessons. You don't go fishing for marlin first, you fish trolling with brightly colored bonito spoons, the local name for a small tuna known in the U.S. as false albacore and in Hawaii as kavik kava. You lure the live musky fish toward you, then thread a line through it, bait hooks along the length of its body, and catch a marlin using it as live bait. On that trip, I was both successful and saddened to see a marlin fighting for its life, and I vowed that it would be my only attempt at big game fishing. But the lesson learned from catching the marlin gave me a plan. I drove home doing breathing exercises until I came to my senses and could pretend I was in the same mood as before. She still wasn't home, and I went about the business I had left undone. Later, she came back with Dean and Kathy, and we fired up the grill and cooked steaks and corn on the cob with claw and warmed baguettes. I spent the day as an active father and a dutiful and loving husband. I was 2 people living in one body, a warm and loving man on the outside and a cynical bastard on the inside. Cynical Adam decided that since her lover was dead and she feared I might put 2 and 2 together, she was trying to do damage control. I was clearly her backup plan. My time with Dean and Kathy was as real as my time with Jean, like a B-movie, but she genuinely believed it. Cynical Adam told me to keep that in mind after the divorce when I was looking for women to hook up with. The next few days turned into a strange existence in which I was simultaneously living a lie and watching myself play my chosen role. I wondered if movie and television actors have similar experiences watching themselves on screen as a character. On a positive note, George and I sorted out the new trading organization, registered it in Singapore, and transferred the entire seed portfolio there. But that wasn't the only good news. CA was trading at $16.30 after the roller coaster ride to market and climbing upward. We had already more than doubled our investment, and as I had hoped, we were looking at a 3-fold return. Given how easily I had sunk into my psychopathic personality, I became paranoid, so I added some significant security measures that required a fingerprint and password, as well as encryption of all my files and emails. I always turned off my laptop and completely deleted all emails that didn't come from George without opening them. Then I would also upload everything I wanted to the cloud and reformat my phone, completely deleting everything and then re-uploading what I needed. After that, all that was left was to research other interesting stock listings and call potential investors I knew from J.P. Morgan in anticipation of me making an offer to buy some of their business. The only thing I wasn't too worried about was the non-compete clause, as the layoff made it mostly invalid. My marriage front went quiet while I waited for the ammunition to arrive, and it arrived on Thursday in the form of a flash drive from Clarence. The handover was done at a different coffee shop than last time because my paranoia was at an all-time high, albeit for no particular reason. He made a list of 14 women. It was everyone he could find. There were brief biographies, and some even had old photos attached. 5 still lived here. One of them worked as an escort, a prostitute, to be exact. So Miller's intervention didn't help her much. She had a number. I went and bought a cell phone, then called her, and we arranged to meet at a motel on the outskirts of town. She said an hour was $100, and I would have to pay for the room. She arrived on time, 2 o'clock in the afternoon. She was small, thin, and tattooed. Her name was Leah, and she stood in the doorway. "Show me the money," those were her first words. I pulled $200 out of my pocket, placed the bills on the bed, and gestured for her to sit down. I raised my hand to stop her. "How do you feel about making $1,000?" I asked. But she jumped up, grabbing her bag. "I don't do that, mister," she said. I assured her. "I'll pay for the information." "What kind?" "I want to know about the home for abused and vulnerable women you were in a few years ago." She wasn't sure, but after some thought, she agreed and told her story briefly. She said that she left home as soon as she left school because she hated her stepfather and ended up on the streets. Eventually, having lost all hope, she began selling herself for food and lodging. One day, John, when she didn't want to do what he wanted, threw her out on the street like trash. She was found by passers-by who called the police. They took her to the hospital, and someone contacted Mrs. Miller, who offered her a place in the house. Once she was discharged, she stayed there for almost 6 months, she said, until the rules and regulations bored her, and she left. She finished her story, and we looked at each other in silence for a while. Her story was typical, though no less tragic. I wondered if what I was about to do would be another case, but the need for revenge took over everything else. "So when you lived in this house, were you bullied right away, or did it start later?" She blinked rapidly, trying to comprehend my question. She started to shake her head no, side to side, then froze. I could see the gears turning in her head. "How much?" I asked. $5,000, I began to negotiate. While I thought about it for a few minutes, she may have been an uneducated prostitute, but her negotiating skills were good enough for any corporate boardroom. "Miller ruined my marriage, and I want to destroy it." I looked at her for signs of hesitation, whether she'd do it for the money or for the greater good. $20,000, she smiled grimly, watching me like a hawk to gauge my reaction. I hesitated, figuring out how plausible she could be. She smirked, looking at me. "What? I can see you pondering whether spending 20 grand on an unimportant person will help your cause." Damn, this young, tattooed woman was on a roll. She leaned toward me, and we ended up nose to nose. "Give me 25, and I'll show you the power of the Me Too movement in action," I told her. We had to plan it out and arrange how the money would be transferred. She told me that she wanted the money so she could get a fresh start elsewhere since she had a little girl and needed to get out of the business. I offered her honestly that if it worked out, I would set her up with a job in Chicago. Her eyes lit up. "For real?" "For real? You're not tricking me just to get what you want?" She looked both hopeful and scared at the same time, like a child who is about to reach for the candy but knows it could be taken away at any moment. I managed to reassure her that everything was fine. We agreed that she would do what she promised, and we would meet to discuss next steps as soon as she was ready. We exchanged numbers. I gave her my phone number and asked her to save it under Jerry's name. I begged off, and phase 1 was complete. At home, I continued my dichotomy of inside and outside, and Jean seemed to keep buying into it. To be fair, she too was focused on the Miller Legacy project to notice much else. I was getting inside as much as I could without making her suspect anything and getting information about how far the project had gotten. We cooked and ate together like old times. During breakfast, she said she'd be busy helping set up New Horizons house, and there would be a grand opening on Monday at 10 o'clock. I already knew about it. It was written about on the company website and social media. I feigned interest and, without appearing to question her, turns out they were planning to have the mayor and his entourage cut the ribbon. A whole bunch of local media was also supposed to be there, as well as the CBS television station. Did they stop the chemo and radiation so Tony could feel well enough to attend? I heard her ask. Probably Evelyn. I didn't hear an answer. It's going to be a life-changing moment, she sobbed slightly. Not if I had anything to do with it. Time to turn up the heat. My divorce papers were ready. All that remained was to get permission to file them. Illinois was a no-fault state in 2016, and there were no laws allowing me to sue Miller for loss of affection either, so it was a matter of irreconcilable differences. I started the day on SGX. Our stock had reached its issue price and was rising, albeit in small increments. A good start to Friday. I had a coffee and tuned into the WMA radio station at 9:30. There was an interview with Evelyn. She was talking about the wonderful social responsibility program that Em and her father, Anthony Miller, had been up to. It was soulful stuff, like chicken soup for the soul. She explained that the New Horizons house is simply an ongoing evolution of a program that her mother started, and after her mother's death. Her father continued. Now, there was an opportunity to turn it into a full-fledged project with full funding, but obviously, it would work better with community participation and donations. The host spoke almost enthusiastically about the value of the project and then asked listeners for their opinions. Listeners spoke favorably, and some promised to donate. The presenter promised to put donation information on the W homepage, and Evelyn said, there are details on the M website and on the New Horizons website. More calls in the same vein followed until, hello, the voice on the other end was hesitant. She was urged to speak louder, and between a broken voice and quiet sobs, she managed to raise her voice. Please, please don't believe the house helped anyone. She managed to croak out, all it did was allow Mr. Miller to abuse women. She burst into tears over the phone. Evelyn went into an apoplectic fit. This never happened. My father is a good man, he would never do anything like this. The caller was still on the line, he did, and more than once. Her voice rose with justifiable indignation and anger. Do you know what I am now? She shouted in a breaking voice. I work the streets, that's all I'm worth, thanks to your precious daddy. Her pain was unbearable. My name is Leah, and your father ruined me, she sobbed, and the connection cut off. The station went into a commercial break. When they returned, the anchor was torn between his original interview and addressing the elephant that filled the airwaves. Evelyn was stunned by this turn of events and tried to explain that it was nonsense and that her father was a good man who would never do anything like that. It was obvious that she believed that, but then again, we all want to believe the best about our parents. All the lines were ringing with people, both scolding and praising Layla. One said, what you'd expect from she's clearly trying to make a buck. Some wanted to ask questions of Evelyn, while others suggested that the authorities, whoever they were, should intervene. The talk show host was no fool. It turned from a little low-interest story into an emotional maelstrom with listeners adding their opinions on what was real and what wasn't. The fervor reached its climax when a well-modulated voice came on the air. My name is Rita. I don't want to give my last name on the air. Her voice was shaky but determined, but I left it with your producer so I can be contacted. She took a shuddering breath. Anthony Miller abused me too, and the remarks went off in different directions. A listener called into WTX to discuss what was happening on WMA. In the next minute, the line was filled with pro and con voices on each side. A short time later, a woman called in. She spoke in a thin, frightened voice. I'm a married woman with children, she cried, and I had hoped to put all this behind me, but Mr. Miller has been harassing me too. She broke down and sobbed on air. I'm so sorry, I promised. I promised I wouldn't say anything, but I can't live with this. I was young and I needed help, and he made me do anything to him. I couldn't say no, I didn't know how. She disconnected. There was a long silence before Master could say anything. It sounded like he was crying. I called Vicky, an old high school friend who works at the local newspaper and anchors the news for 2 regional radio stations. I asked if she had heard about what was going on at WMA and WTX. She had. I told her I was concerned because my wife works for M in the New Horizon Home Project. I asked her opinion. She wasn't sure but was going to look into the matter. She said if it was true, it would be the biggest abuse case in Springfield in 2 generations. By lunchtime, the story had gone quiet on the air. None of the radio hosts wanted to offer an opinion. However, social media and Twitter, in particular, went wild. At first, opinions were split. 50 to 50 for and against, but within hours, it turned into a fierce witch hunt, and woe betide anyone who sided with Miller. Hundreds and then thousands of women took to the platforms to tell their stories of abuse from a variety of sources. Some were detailed, others were nothing more than an admission of Me Too. Some were so graphic that they could be categorized as X-rated. Within hours, it was impossible to distinguish truth from nonsense. The information went viral and spread not only across states but entire continents. I passed out with a massive headache. I reached for the Tylenol. The day was early, and the kids were still in school. From the stress and emotions I had experienced, I was sweating and feeling dirty. I undressed in the laundry room, walked naked to the shower, and collapsed under a stream of warm water. I sat down and cried like I hadn't cried since my mom died. In fact, I cried harder. Losing my mom was a knife to my heart, but it was a knife to my soul. I had crossed a line that could no longer be crossed. Nietzsche's saying that he who fights monsters must be careful not to become a monster himself accurately described me. Miller had done bad things to me, but I had unleashed a firestorm that I had already lost control of. All I could do now was hang on and pray. I picked up Dean and Kathy and drove home to make chicken stir-fry with noodles and a small Oriental salad on the side. We waited for Jean, but there was nothing. I tried to call her, but her phone was off. We finally ate, and I put a plate of food for Jean in the microwave and a small bowl of salad in the refrigerator. Dean, Katie, and I sat down to play the Forbidden Island board game, and Jean was still gone. By 10, the kids had gone to their bedrooms, and I was alone in the living room when she came in. She looked like she'd just been through the ringer. The shadows over her eyes were streaming, her hair was a mess, and she had the aura of a woman whose world had just crumbled. "You heard," she sighed with a shudder. "Have you heard all the nasty things they say about Tony?" she groaned, collapsing into a chair. I handed her a large brandy, which she gratefully accepted, drinking half of it in one gulp. "Yeah, sounds like your boss is a predator," I told her in an even, emotionless voice. "Where there's smoke, there's fire." "No, Adam, he's a good man. He would never do anything like this," she insisted. "It's time to get to phase 2, Jean," I said. She looked up from her brandy. "You obviously didn't know the man very well." "You don't know me." I turned the screws. "You and I have no secrets, we're husband and wife. So you know what I'm capable of, just like I know you." I held her gaze. "You may know Miller as your boss, but who knows what he's really like?" I watched the conflicting thoughts and emotions play across her face. No, he's a good man. He would never do anything like that. I would know." I threw her a helplessly confused look. "But how, Jean? How do you know?" "I mean, he's your boss, your coworker. He could be hiding a million secrets. I haven't interacted with him that much, but I always felt like he was hiding something. He's the kind of guy you wouldn't leave alone with your wife or daughters," she sighed. "And you? Has he ever tried anything with you?" I asked. She turned white, and I pretended not to notice. No, never." "How can you even ask that?" She tried to snap at me, but ended up just looking dumbfounded. "Because you're a pretty woman, Jean, and if what they say about him is true, he must be very immoral," I said. She burst into tears and looked deeply into her glass of brandy, but found no answers there either. She finished it and headed upstairs. Tiredly, she said hello to Dean and Kathy and said good night, and then I heard the shower running. I finished my cognac and headed to bed. By the time she got out of the shower, I pretended to be half asleep. She came downstairs in her robe. I climbed out of bed and made my way to the landing. She was talking to someone from the sound of it, probably to Evelyn. She repeated nightmare several times, then she asked, "But why? Why isn't there more than one woman saying she was attacked?" Finally, she said she didn't think it would go away easily. How right she was, she made a second call. "Hi, Tony," I heard her say. I caught snippets of phrases where she kept telling him that everything would be resolved and it was some big misunderstanding. I barely heard her remove herself to the kitchen, but I caught her last words, "I love you too." I heard the microwave beep, and she spent some time alone, probably snacking. By the time she got to bed, I was asleep. Saturday, I woke up first and made breakfast, and then drove Dean and Kathy to sports practice. When I got home, I was on the phone with Vicky. She informed me that another woman had applied, and there were 4 so far. She also told me that her sources in the mayor's office said that the entire project was now considered toxic and was being distanced from it. A number of civic associations soon followed with denials. By mid-morning, the Attorney General's office had issued a statement that they would conduct a full investigation into the matter. By the time I got home, it was gone. The SGX exchange was closed, so there was nothing to do. I talked to George about business and to my father about the state of my marriage. He agreed that it was irretrievably broken. He said he felt sorry for Dean and Kathy, but like the rest of the kids in the U.S., they would learn to cope. I called Jean. "Where are you, Evelyn? I and the company lawyers are trying to fight these nasty lawsuits. Are you sure you should get involved?" I colored my voice with concern. "The spillover could be significant, and you don't want to be in it." She resisted, as I knew she would, but all their lawyerly entreaties went nowhere. On Saturday afternoon and Sunday, which were the busiest days of the show, AM had less than 20% of its previous attendance. By Monday morning, the phones were ringing off the hook with calls of canceled and withdrawn sales orders. The opening of the New Horizons home was postponed until the negative publicity was over that Monday. Another woman made herself known in an unusual way. This woman was married to a wealthy businessman and was well known in the community. According to her, she spent a total of 8 days in the house before she gave them her name, and they contacted her parents. During that time, the man she knew as Mr. Miller abused her twice. She left her lawyers details for all the women who had been assaulted by Miller to contact him so they could file a class action lawsuit. By the end of that week, 5 things had happened. First, Miller was interviewed by the district attorney at the hospital, after which his condition deteriorated. Second, 3 of the 5 women came to the police and testified. All of them claimed to have been assaulted. Interestingly, all of the assaults occurred within a short period of time, about 5 years ago. Third, the media storm escalated to the point where AM closed its doors until further notice. Jean naively told me every night about how Evelyn was trying to keep the business going while vendors were leaving and taking customers with them. Fourth, CA had passed the $24 mark, and I was slowly throwing blocks of shares onto the market which were quickly snapped up without lowering their price. We made back our original investment and still own 2/3 of the stock. To put it bluntly, we sat back in complete delight. My dad took Dean and Kathy out for the weekend. I was on my way back from a small boutique where I bought a chilled bottle of 2012 vintage Veuve Clicquot. I was ready to celebrate with Jean. Number 5, I noticed a BMW X5 SUV with the M logo on the doors parked in my driveway next to Jean's Lexus. I stopped and walked into the house. They were in the living room. Jean was crying, and Evelyn was stroking her back and generally calming her down. "Ladies," I saluted them, walked over to the cabinet where our crystal was kept, and pulled out 3 champagne flutes. They stared at me dumbfounded with open mouths as I tore off the foil, twisted the wire to remove the cage, and popped the cork with opulence. Then I filled 3 flutes copiously and handed them each one. They were both in a sort of stupor, as if their brains were tilted, and accepted the proffered glasses. "Salute." I raised my toast, drank half of mine, and burped. Then the shouting began. "Jean, you're divorcing me? I thought we were a family." I noticed an open envelope with divorce papers lying on the coffee table. "Evelyn, how could you? Adam, don't you care about your wife?" Don't you love her? Have a drink, Jean. We're celebrating the end of an era. I finished the rest of the champagne and reached for the bottle. Hello, Evelyn. First of all, I could, and I did. Second, I stopped caring about her and stopped loving her when she became your father's. I knocked over my glass and saluted Evelyn. Let's drink to your father's legacy. Evelyn, I hope he lives long enough to stand trial, and then the whole world will know what a piece of shit he really is. She turned white and collapsed onto her back. I turned to Jean. Get yourself a lawyer, I smirked at her. The kids will stay with my father until custody is established. Her eyes widened with fear. This was like nothing she'd ever seen me like before. It looked like I had turned into the very monster I feared. Evelyn dropped her flute on the carpet, making a mess. They looked at me the way one looks at a madman with his finger on the trigger. So, for champagne, no? You left me alone for so long and so often. I needed human contact, she tried to justify herself, but couldn't meet my gaze. I understand, I laughed humorlessly. And how do you manage that now? But then Evelyn came at me again. And how many women did you sleep with while you were away from home? You men all want your women to be angels when you're away from home, and you do whatever you want. Don't think all men act like the piece of shit who gave birth to you. Just because he was happy to do whatever he could, ruining young women and marriages doesn't mean the rest of us stoop to his depravity. I stared at her, hoping she would try to object or even pounce on me. I leaned into her face. Your father is a molester, a criminal, a disgusting pig. He'll probably die before he goes to prison. But you, my wife, and the world will recognize him for what he is. His legacy project will never take off, and his money will be frozen by the courts against future lawsuits by his victims. M will file for bankruptcy and cease to exist, and you'll have to move far away and change your name. She trembled and cried at my verbal assault. I bet she wished she was a man to hit me. I wished she was a man too, so I could unleash the rage I'd so carefully contained for the last weeks. In fact, it seems to me, Evelyn, that you probably helped woo these girls the way Ghislaine Maxwell did Jeffrey Epstein. Her mouth worked wordlessly at the horror I was spouting. I think I need to contact the news media to let them know about you. She shook her head from side to side, her eyes widened with fear and horror. No, please. I didn't do this. It's all a lie, some kind of mistake. I don't know what these women are trying to accomplish, but it's not true. My father is a good man. I turned to Jean. You have 2 hours to gather your clothes and leave. When I return, if you're still here, I'll call the press and make a statement. Moreover, I will invite them to interview you about your involvement in this horrible crime. Screw you, she spat at me. I have nothing to apologize for. Well, except for cheating and lying. I'll move out, but I'll hire a lawyer first thing, and then we'll see who gets what. Oh, God, Jean found the strength. 2 hours, I promised her. I got out and headed for the car, but had only gone a few blocks down the road when all the unused adrenaline in my body caught up with me, and I gasped and shook. This went on for about 15 minutes before I got my body under control and was able to move on. For a while, I drove aimlessly around the city. Eventually, I pulled myself together and called my father. I told him about Jean handing over the papers and reiterated that he should keep Dean and Kathy with him until further notice. And while he should allow Jean to visit them, under no circumstances should she be left alone with them to set them against me. We talked, and I drove off before the car signaled that I was on standby. I found a gas station, got gas, and headed home, marveling at how far from home I was. By the time I got back, it was 10 o'clock. The house was like a mausoleum filled with the ghosts of happy times. The silence was noisy in my ears, and I couldn't sleep. 2,500 years ago, Socrates had said that life without exploration is not worth living, and I lay in bed trying hard not to explore myself or look too deeply into my psyche because of the furor I'd made for revenge. The only thing I knew for sure was that things had gone too far, and there was no stopping it. I was afraid that what was happening on social media was one thing, but if it went to court, things could unravel or fall apart. Would I not find myself implicated? I felt the need to get Leah out of town to at least eliminate my direct connection to the issue. Having decided this, I managed to sink into a half slumber. Waking up the next morning, I felt almost as tired as the moment I climbed into bed. After my morning rituals, I headed downtown to get some breakfast. I called the kids. They were doing well, but Dean already suspected that all was not well at home. I promised I'd talk to him and Katie soon. Over a cup of coffee, I reached Isla on the landline. "So, did I do as well as I promised?" I admitted that I had. We talked and confirmed that she was flying to Chicago the next day. I had already transferred money from my offshore trading account to one of George's offshore accounts. Then he had transferred small amounts to a bank account she had opened, and Isla was $25,000 richer and off to a job as a property management assistant organized by one of George's investment contacts who owned a number of commercial properties. I was drinking my second cup of coffee when Vicky called. 3 women have sued Miller seeking damages, she informed me. The papers will be served on Monday. We talked for a while. She said she and the news editors were surprised by the timing and how the whole story had unfolded, but she reasoned that it wasn't surprising in the current climate. Once the first woman, Lila, who claimed she was a prostitute, got publicity, the rest followed, as in the case of Harvey Weinstein. I spent the rest of Saturday with Dean and Kathy. I told them that their mom and I would be getting a divorce because she was having an affair with her boss, Anthony Miller. Kathy didn't quite understand what an affair was. Dean understood. "She slept with Mr. Miller, Dad," I nodded sadly. "Yeah, they've been sleeping together for a while now." Kathy was crying. Dean was unfazed. We packed up and, taking my dad with us, went to the golf course and hit a few buckets of balls. Dean and Kathy used some of my old clubs, and both had a good natural swing. After eating dinner, we went to a Greek restaurant and eventually headed to bed. I went back to my quiet Melum and had another sleepless night. On Sunday, I got a call from her parents. They wanted to know if there was any hope of reconciliation for the sake of the child. How can I reconcile with a woman who has been having an affair with her boss for years? I asked. And that one happens to be a maniac. Jean may have even had a part in it. There was a collective sigh. Living in Arizona had weaned them off the bomb that had hit Illinois. It will all be figured out in court, I assured them, and walked away, leaving them with a shattered view of their daughter. Life went on, mostly slowly and painfully. Dean and Katie moved back into my home, and my father moved in to help out. This essentially left me with a business that was gaining momentum, as George and I were getting lots of positive feedback. At the end of the second week, the hype around Miller had died down somewhat. Vicky informed me that a 4th woman had joined the class action lawsuit against Miller, but not Leah. I thought that was odd. She was edgy enough and seemed mercurial enough to get her piece of the pie. Oh well, that was a mystery for another day. I had a meeting between Jean's lawyers and my lawyers about the division of property. I had set up investment accounts for Dean and Kathy's education out of our combined cash or near-cash assets so they couldn't be touched. My last paycheck and payments from J.P. Morgan went directly into my offshore account, and her lawyers were still trying to get documents from my previous employer. So, while they suspected there was some sort of golden handshake going on, they had no idea how much. But it was only a matter of time before they subpoenaed the HR documents. I offered to pay her nothing, as she had a job and was generally making a good living. She argued that there should have been at least $250,000 in cash and near assets. I assured them that they had been lost on unprofitable stocks. Both Jean and her lawyer called, but I laughed. "Take the deal, Jean, or I'll take your house payment down, and we'll fight over it until you run out of money for lawyers. I'll ruin you financially. Why are you being such an..." She looked at me. "I deserve half of whatever is left of our marriage," she said. "Go to your second husband and ask him for money, Jean." It sounds like you had more of a marriage with him than you did with me. But you'd better hurry. He may not have any money left after those poor assaulted women get what he did to them. I wish I could say it was all over after that, but it wasn't. Not at all. It dragged on for months, but most of the cards were in my hands, and righteous anger kept me going. She hesitated from meeting to meeting. At one, she was saying that I made the whole relationship between her and Miller look much more serious than it really was. At the next meeting, she blamed me for her behavior. Then she wanted to know why we had to get a divorce and that we couldn't work it out. The next time, I heard from her that she was going to give me to the cleaners. At another meeting where I refused to give in, her lawyer said he would get her back in the house immediately. I gave her my biggest grin. You'd better be careful around me, Jean, or I will go to every possible media outlet to expose your complicity in this. She lost her white and turned gray, like a heart attack victim. Try it and see what happens to you next. As I left the lawyer's office, I noticed Evelyn sitting in the foyer. She was glaring at me angrily. I smiled at her the way one smiles at the walking dead, and her smile faltered and faded. You should have stayed out of this, Evelyn. Well, what you sow is what you reap. 2 days later, Leo was another $5,000 richer, and the local newspapers, Twitter, and the rest of social media were ablaze with the latest revelations that Evelyn Miller had been helping her disgraced father, Anthony Miller. The DA's office has come under fire for not arresting Miller or taking action against his daughter. The DA's office spoke at a media briefing, stating that they were still in the early stages of the investigation. The press didn't hold back, and another storm erupted. The public was still reeling from the story of Ghislaine Maxwell and Jeffrey Epstein. Soon, the bloodlust was gripping Evelyn Miller as well. Miller was sued by 4 highly publicized women. I became seriously concerned and began having sleepless nights. Going to court was a huge risk for me and could have easily derailed the whole case. It was the 6th week since my return from Singapore. I was working from home as usual when the doorbell rang. It was Evelyn. What do you need? I wasn't going to pretend. Can we talk, Adam? No, I don't want to be associated with a predator like you. I glared at her and closed the door, leaving her standing outside. She called again, just as I knew she would. She rang. Please, Adam, just talk, she begged. I felt like laughing out loud. Where's your entitlement? Instead, I said, I don't think so. You just want to record me and try to get me to say something you can use for your own purposes. I won't. I promise. Her eyes lit up, but I held out my hand, stopping her. But first, put your purse and phone in the car. Wait here. I closed the door, unobtrusively set my phone down, and pressed record. Okay, talk. I let her go and moved to the nearest couch. She looked unsure whether to stand or sit, but I motioned for her to sit across from me, and she sat on the edge as if she might rush off at any minute. She brushed her loose hair out of her face and pulled herself together. I know it's you, Adam. You're the one who created this whole nightmare. I just stared at her without emotion. She probably thought I was a serpent in her Garden of Eden. Stop it now, Adam. I just sat there looking at her in silence, and she changed the subject. I know you were hurt by Jean's affair with my father. Whoever was hurt, but this nonsense about my father subjecting women is a lie and it needs to stop. It needs to be disproved, she said. I laughed in her face. There's nothing I can do, Evelyn. It's up to the court now. Please, Adam, please, make it stop. I know you can, she pleaded. I smiled unhappily. Now that your world has collapsed, you want me to help you. Where were you when your father was entertaining my wife? Her face turned red again. Oh, yes, you were helping, making sure she agreed to be your father's. We stared at each other in silence for a long time. I read her face as she picked and rejected arguments to change my mind. Finally, she said, "Will you stop, Adam? Will you be satisfied?" Her eyes grew cloudy, then tears rolled down her face, and she visibly snickered. This was no pretense, this was a woman defeated. Not until your family is completely destroyed, Evelyn, I said. She shuddered, her eyes widened in horror. There will be no stopping, there will be no ceasefire, there will be no peace, I spoke slowly and purposefully. I wanted her to realize this wasn't a game she could back down from, this was real. She realized the truth and fell silent as she thought about what I had said. Then she surprised me by coming back for another try. You want revenge on Adam? How? How? She clasped her hands together and stared at the floor, unable to meet my eyes. She was in her early 30s, unmarried, and had no children. Her Facebook pages indicated that she had recently broken up with her last partner, so she was single. Staggering, she reached the door and, on unsteady legs, ran to her BMW. I watched her drive unevenly down the street. I had conflicting feelings of satisfaction at having caused her pain and letting her know that more would follow. At the same time, I felt disgusted at my ability to be so callous and cruel to another person's feelings. It was still early, but I wanted a drink, and maybe more than one. I spent the rest of the weekend and out of law offices. In between, I continued to work on getting new clients. There was a listing on the Hong Kong Stock Exchange for a small IT company that looked promising, and a listing on the Johannesburg Stock Exchange for a natural gas exploration company drilling in the Indian Ocean off the coast of South Africa. George and I were completing due diligence before presenting them to a group of investors. The 4 women's class action lawsuit against Miller was in full swing. The Millers, led by Evelyn and her attorneys, were trying to mitigate the situation and reach an out-of-court settlement. The district attorney could not make up his mind on how to prosecute a man on his deathbed, so we all waited with bated breath. I heard the Millers had been cleaned out of almost every penny. All the real estate owned by the company was sold, and the women got over $2 million each. The amount was not disclosed, but it was huge. It was effectively the end of MRE. I needed one more thing to complete my revenge. So, I went to the hospital and entered Miller's room, looking official and walking as if I belonged. No one had challenged me. I was there to make sure he knew who had ruined him, his legacy, and his whole life. He lived for 2 more days. Evelyn had him cremated. There were only 5 people at the small gathering after the cremation. One of them was Jean. She wanted to take Dean and Kathy with her. I told her I would see her dead first. You would, wouldn't you? She looked at me with a mixture of fear and hatred, very similar to the one Evelyn had during our last meeting. I didn't realize you were so vindictive. You ruined him, it was you, wasn't it? She cried. And for what? Because he and I had a relationship, you went crazy and ruined so many lives. Tears rolled down her face. I laughed harshly. You're the one who planted the seeds, Jean. You. Why didn't you just tell me you wanted someone else? It would have hurt me, but it would have been honest. We could have gotten a divorce, and that would have been the end of it. But you chose to neglect me, and that was unacceptable. For a moment, she became thoughtful. I loved Tony, she admitted quietly. He gave me what I needed when he was with me. He was with me 100%. With you, I always felt like your job came first and I came second. She rummaged through her purse, found a pack of tissues, and wiped her eyes. Then when we had Dean and Katie, I wasn't even in second place. It was your job, the kids, and I got whatever was left. She looked me in the eye. I needed someone to put me first for a change. I could have walked away and left her with my happy memories, but I didn't. I pulled out my phone. Listen to this. Was it worth it? She heard me say. No, he wheezed. You ruined everything I spent a lifetime working for. I laughed harshly. It's your own fault, Miller. I screwed you up big time. How did you find out? What? How did you find out about me using them? There was a long silence while I tried to comprehend what I'd said, and then I started laughing and couldn't stop. I dropped my phone. Then I finally got my laughter under control. I didn't do it, I started laughing again. Oh, miracle, I didn't know, Miller. I thought I was making it all up, but now I realize why those 4 women pursued you the way they did. All it took was one little crack, and then it all burst. Screw you, Carter, he wheezed, panting. Those women owed me. He tried to sit up to show he still had some bravado left. Then he collapsed to the floor and fell into catatonia. I walked away. She was no longer my problem. Epilogue. When Mr. was getting rid of assets as fast as they could to free up cash, I bought the house they were converting into New Horizons House for next to nothing. It took some effort to get all the players together, but everything fell into place as if it was predetermined. As soon as the deal was signed and sealed, I took out ads in the local papers and went on the radio announcing that I had purchased New Horizons House and would turn it into a full-fledged shelter for abused women. It would be run by women only, and men would have no part in its operations and daily affairs. I renamed it Joy Carter House in honor of my mother. Dad cried and kissed me. Dean and Kathy were impressed. The house was placed in trust for Dad and me, and the 4 women who had sued Miller became trustees. They were all more than happy to be involved and contributed some of their newfound wealth to make the dream come true. The local and regional media called the project Phoenix and showered me and the women with praise. Although I tried to stay as far away from the spotlight as possible, besides being a social responsibility initiative, it also helped me look good in front of a judge when it came to my divorce. Jean ended up getting primary custody. I would pay alimony until Dean and Katie turned 18, and Jean could stay in the house until then, but she would have to contribute 50% toward the mortgage payment, and alimony would be 0 for her. At one meeting when we were trying to divide who gets what, she claimed I hid the money. I told her to drop it or I would turn her life to, and oddly enough she did. She became very wary of me, and I could see her carefully choosing her words so as not to upset me. I suppose that's what fear looked like. I told her that she would get a substantial income from the house when it sold, and that was the end of it. It took a while, but eventually, we divorced. I bought a 3-bedroom condo so the kids could stay with me. I had them almost every weekend. Since Jean was back to selling houses, and weekends were her busiest period, so it was good for me. I missed them from time to time as I started traveling regularly again, especially to the Far East, but overall life wasn't too bad. I laughed at myself. Things were bad, but not that bad. Jean's relationship with Evelyn broke down immediately after I showed her the tape of my run-in with Miller. I also circulated an edited version of the tape of her father's voice confessing everything. It was actually another thing that took on a life of its own independent of the original intent. Evelyn left a couple of months later, and I never heard from or about her again. I met Leah in Chicago. Her real name was Leanne Roxton. She had cleaned herself up and was enjoying her work. "Did you know?" I asked her. "It was like an open secret," she confirmed. No one admitted to the abuse directly. Everyone was afraid that if they were kicked out on the street, it would be worse. "Why didn't you tell me about it, too?" I asked, wondering. She laughed and shook her head. "I had no idea," she admitted. "Well, for one thing, I wasn't abused or anything like that. I contacted a few women I know and asked them if they'd be willing to say they were abused, and I'd give them $5,000. She glared at me, daring me to object to her mercurial actions, but I had no time to talk. The second woman with whom I was still in touch was Rita French. On the phone, she fell apart and disconnected from me. But when I called the radio station a few days later when Miller's daughter went on the air, as you heard, the first one was Rita. Apparently, she decided she'd held onto him long enough. She sipped her soda. I didn't even have to pay her. I phoned her after the radio show, and she mentioned she vaguely recalled one of the others. However, before she could attempt to reach out to her, the #MeToo movement began organically, and once it gained momentum, the entire situation took on a life of its own. "You could have profited greatly," I commiserated. She sadly shook her head. By the time they filed suit against Miller, I was in Chicago, and honestly, I was completely out of the loop. When I checked back, it was already resolved, she reminisced with a hint of a smile, reflecting on what might have been. But you gave me a solid start, Adam. Thank you. And with that, it was done. My vengeance was fulfilled, and remarkably, my actions seemed justified. It exceeded my expectations. Despite telling myself I wasn't a villain, was I? The Millers were ruined, akin to characters in a fictional tale. I absorbed lessons in revenge and executed them in manners I never envisioned. Financially, my fortunes were on the rise. The business flourished, and George broached the idea of my buying him out to facilitate his retirement. Dean and Kathy adapted to life as teenagers do, their focus shifting to academics, friends, and sports. Mom and Dad faded into the background, transforming into convenient ATMs and chauffeurs. Life carried on as usual. Roughly 4 years post-divorce, Jean began dating an older gentleman. They eventually tied the knot after living together for a while. Dean and Kathy spoke highly of him. Meanwhile, I remained single, devoid of any romantic prospects, indicating lingering trust issues. At my father's insistence, I eventually sought help from a trauma counselor and embarked on the journey of self-improvement, though I acknowledge I still have a long road ahead. And that's the end. Thank you for following along. I hope you found it engaging. Don't forget to subscribe to my channel and stay tuned for the next video.